No, it's fine. You do. Yep. Yeah.
Here we go.
Great. Thank you.
Okay.
Yep.
Oh.
Yeah, it's fine. Great. Thank you.
So I missed the part where they told people where they can get their.
Headsets.
Yeah.
I think they've figured
There?
them out over
Okay,
there.
good.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we can start.
Yep.
Ready?
Yep.
Okay, we're going to start this session of Meet the Author. So welcome to the Discovery Lab. It's my pleasure to introduce Julia Hobsbawm, who's the author of this book, Fully Connected, Surviving and Thriving in the Age of Overload. Julia is honorary visiting professor at London's Cass Business School and at the University of Suffolk. She has defined social health as the antidote to the age of overload for businesses, government, and individuals. In 2005, she founded the successful knowledge networking business Editorial Intelligence. In 2016, she launched Networking Nations as a response to Brexit. She produces and co-presents the podcast series Human and the Machine. In addition, Ms. Hobsbawm has written and presented 2 series for BBC Radio 4 and regularly appears on television and radio networks and podcasts. Julia, the floor is yours.
Hello, thank you. So, can everybody with their headsets hear me? We're good, okay. It's a new format for me. I've written a book that actually in paperback has a different subtitle, and the subtitle is Social Health in an Age of Overload. And I thought I would explain a little bit about what I think social health is, but I was going to begin by reading from the book in English. I apologize. And because I think it will explain the context for what I think social health is, which is something that affects organizations, individuals, is about systemic change, policy change, management, leadership, but also about personal development and well-being. My book is partly a memoir of the telex to Twitter era. I'm old enough that my daughter, who was born 01, said to me, "Mum, when you were alive, were there cars or just horses?" You know, so there's that sense of time passing. So I wanted to capture that massive shift in technology that's happened really in a very accelerated way, and also to look at the world of networks, in which network science informs so much about how we understand behavior and the possibilities to change our behavior and be better connected rather than fully connected. So I'm going to read from the book. One day in 2014, the reclusive British singer Kate Bush put tickets for her first show in 35 years on sale in the internet, and every single ticket sold out in 15 minutes because of the network effects of the internet. Word spread like an epidemic, and Kate Bush used an interesting language of disease to say her response to this sellout was that she was completely overwhelmed. Society is underpinned and connected by a mosaic of networks, and we don't even notice them most of the time. Networks are the structure, animal, plant, machine, human, that carry everything from gossip to megabytes, telecommunications to pop concerts. And all networks spread faster with an accelerant. And in the case of HIV, it's unprotected sex. In the case of the Zika virus, it is the water on which mosquitoes breed. The accelerant can be political, like poverty. Wherever people connect, they spread something. Over 5,000 miles away in that same year that Kate Bush was selling out accelerated tickets of pop concerts, a young woman in a corner of Guinea, Equatorial West Africa, was creating a structurally similar set of networks in an entirely different way. She walked across she crossed from one nation to another, from Guinea to Sierra Leone, using a dugout canoe. No one stopped her, and she was infected with Ebola. And the network physicist Albert Lajlo Badabashi analyzes the components of different kinds of networks, and he calls the kind that begins to replicate exponentially, spiraling out of control, as a scale-free network. The network that's structurally similar to the spread of a virus like Ebola is the internet. And in this instance, 11,000 people were infected in the space of a single year. Culture and disease and ideas, the connective tissue is very similar. And when they reach epidemic levels, it's called the tipping point, Malcolm Gladwell. But how do we untip or reduce the wrong kind of spread, like panic or addictive copycat behavior. The best weapon against Ebola turned out to be quarantine. Politically complicated to do, but it was the most effective mechanism. But word of mouth spread is very difficult to quarantine. The radical hatred inside terrorist cells, much of which happened in and around Paris and Belgium, that was very hard to contain. The intelligence networks fail. There's too much information. They can't keep up with the excess of information in those excessive networks. And so that brings me to social health and what I call having the knot of knowledge plus networks plus time working in harmony together, where you have the right amount of information, not too much information. You have networks that spread trust and understanding and intimate connection rather than networks that just accelerate like the internet. And the timeliness, how do you act and behave? How do you alter things? How do you make change? There was undoubtedly poor physical health in West Africa in 2014 during the Ebola outbreak, but we can easily track the misconception, the misconnection and disconnection at a political and a bureaucratic level, from the World Health Organization's famously slow response to the mismanagement by regional politicians. So the outbreak was a cautionary tale about how we understand the power of connection and how we behave differently around it. So that was a little bit from my book. And my starting position really is the creation of the World Health Organization itself in 1946, so 70 years ago. And I became interested in the idea that the concept of social well-being is embedded in that definition of health, that health is not merely the presence of injury and disease, but of social well-being. But it hasn't been updated during the time when we are now surrounded by electronic communication and connection. And the reason why I think it's an interesting metaphor to use health is because I think we are experiencing at a social level, at a political level, at a cultural level, signs of stress and ill health. So 10 million working days a year are lost in the EU to stress. Productivity is stagnant. In Britain alone, the productivity metrics do that a little bit, but from a low base. You know, one quarter they might go up a little bit, but they don't really improve. So I believe there's a connection between high stress, low productivity, and the fact that we have, in 25 years, become fully connected. There isn't a single corner of society which isn't experiencing what has been called the death of distance, that computers and technology used to be hidden from us, or it used to be the infrastructure underneath us or behind a wall or at the end of a room. And now it's here, it's in our hands. We are fully connected to the point of being embedded. This time next year, everybody attending this conference will know someone that has an embedded sensor, probably for health reasons, if not for other reasons. And so what does that mean to a society that is not getting more productive, that is not experiencing lower levels of stress? There must be a correlation. And I think most simply, and maybe we'll discuss it when I finish this point, I think most simply we have become infatuated by and mistakenly in love with the idea of scale and speed. And I believe that that idea has been effectively marketed and sold by Silicon Valley. That the human dimension that is slow and intimate, that can only really anthropologically hold 150 relationships at a time, that only has 168 hours in the week, that only has 200 nations that are, recognized, that somehow the human is less valid than a scaled, speeded up process. Capitalism talks about how quickly can you get to scale. We are very familiar with large numbers that there are 60 million messages a day just on the Facebook platform alone, that Facebook's network effects doubled from, you had 500 million, then it jumped to 1 billion, it's now 2 billion. And the point is that, of course, we have all this accelerated speed and scale, and we live with that, and policymakers want to look at the big numbers, but it isn't how humans are. Humans operate intimately with trust. And so my call is to recognize that how we manage the ingredients of connectedness, our information flows. We need to be able to find information and trust information. We can't have so much of it that we drown in it. We can't have life mediated on social networks. We need people face-to-face networks. That means we need time to invest in relationship building, not networking occasions. We need to reframe what building relationships looks like. And finally, we need to be realistic about the time. And so taking the idea of health is a way of saying, okay, we have obesity and we have infobesity. We have blocked arteries and we have network blockages. We have starvation and nutritional deficiencies, and we have time poverty. And we need to look at our ways of solving our behaviors and creating change around that framework. And it's a privilege to be asked to talk to those people interested in policy making and business change about these ideas, and I look forward to discussing them.
Great. Thank you very much.
It's really peculiar talking to people that I trust have got me in their ear.
I hope it's all working for you. If not, we're just talking to each other up here. Anyway, now's the segment where I open up the floor and allow all of you to ask Julia some questions. I think there should be a microphone around somewhere, but we don't actually have it here.
Or make comments.
Ah, there it is. Okay. There's a question right over there.
Hello. Hi, my name's Fennel Waters. I'm with the UK delegation to the OECD. Big believer in what you're saying as well, in that from my point of view, it's almost like, I don't know, we need to raise our consciousness so that we don't abuse the technology that is far ahead of what our consciousness is. You were saying about looking at solutions. Have you any idea from your personal perspective on what kind of solutions that could possibly be? I mean, I know there's a lot of mindfulness programs coming into schools and policy making, parliaments, that kind of thing, but I didn't know if you had any other ideas.
Well, I can't condense it all, but essentially I think we need to regard the movement around wellness and well-being as being about productivity. And we need to narrow the gap between the idea that physical and mental wellness is a sort of soft aspect of workplace, and regard it as a hard component of how we produce productively. And what that means is we have to also close the gap between the concept of leadership and grandiosity in the way we run organizations and a much more practical management and process. What that means is you need to redraw the way HR is configured, talent, recruitment, and you need to experiment. I'm very interested in the literature that came out of organizational behavior around about the time that the internet really took off. And there's a whole spontaneous amount of writing about organizations as jazz ensembles or orchestras. And I think many of us still lead organizational lives that are quite rigid, quite hierarchical, quite siloed, quite sort of linear. And that isn't necessarily how you get change, how you get flow, how you get the benefits of what we absolutely know diversity of thought and perspective and experience brings. So I'm for fairly radical change, I'm afraid. I'm for fairly radical change.
And there's another question. Yeah.
Yeah, hi, Shutter from the OECD. I'm a father, I'm a child, and my question is basically that I feel challenged to deal with communication and overload, both in direction towards my parents.
Yeah.
I see that Facebook and Skype and all that is a huge opportunity for me to connect with my parents in northern Germany and see them and but they handle the overload by basically saying, well, the world is changing, but I'm not changing.
Yes.
So they kind of, in my view, are reclusive. You know, they withdraw, basically. On the other hand, I'm a father of 4 children who are basically exposed with a huge amount of data, which I'm hardly able to control. Now, I position myself somewhere in between and think, well, I'm a mature adult and I can deal with these kind of situations and challenges in more or less in a mature fashion. But I feel basically that I'm drawn into two directions and are really completely incompetent, to a certain extent, to bridge these generations, which are transforming so rapidly.
Yes.
So I'm trying to coach my kids, but at the same time also trying to coach my parents. And I find that an extremely difficult situation in the time of, you know, where we are all fully connected and basically are overloaded with potential information coming our way. I don't wonder whether that's something you have been reflecting about.
I think it's a really good point. We are at an inflection point. The good news is I have not stopped being invited to talk since this book was published in hardback, which is great, but it's also a sign of something. People want now to change. That sort of Internet 1.0 became, you know. So the good news is we are at an inflection point. The bad news is we are stuck with a lot of intractable problems that you can't just say do that. You can't switch off. You can't actually disconnect. So we are in what I call a hostile landscape. Those of us in developed economies, those of us at work, those of us, you only have to look at the corporation to see that it is effectively in crisis, structurally, managerially, operationally, because there's too much. However, I also feel that rumors of our demise are a bit exaggerated. I still think the human has the answers. I still think the human, which is the most resilient creature, other than perhaps the honeybee, has great capacity to evolve and change and reframe. And I'm not sure that it's helpful for us to say part of the problem is intergenerational. Yes, my mother, who's 86, has enormous problems comprehending the technology. From one day to the next, she can do the iPad or can't. Yes, I also have 5 children ranging from 13 to 27, and they're digitally native, and sometimes, they are too much online. But actually what I feel is we are more alike than we are unalike, to quote Mr. Shakespeare. I don't really see a fundamental difference. Yes, there is evidence that if you have repeated use of technology unmediated by face-to-face connection, that your wiring does change. You know, we know that, but we also know the brain is very elastic and plastic, and you can unmake some of the changes. So I think we need to not be frightened of the technology. We need to say, what are we doing as actors? How are we creating networks? How are we creating knowledge flows? How are we spending our time in a micro way? We can't always look at the macro because that can actually make us inactive. In other words, I'm sure you look like the kind of man that has family meals, that gathers your family around a table regularly. I'm sure you're the sort of manager that brings different areas of expertise and perspectives into the room. These changes make big impact. So I want us to ask what we can do rather than what we can't do. I'm a pessimistic optimist.
Anybody else want to ask a question?
Does no one want to talk about email? Because, of course, France has been very forward in email. I was interviewed by the BBC when the law came in. How many of you abide by that law and don't send email? Is it what's the time you can't send emails after in France?
Is that even still in effect anymore? I never hear anybody
That's really
talking
interesting.
about
Nobody's talking. It's not true.
Yeah.
That was just somebody flew a kite and said it was happening. It hasn't happened?
Well, one of the things I wanted to ask, if I may, take an opportunity here, is, humans may be very adaptable, but the machines aren't always so adaptable, and even less so is corporate culture or workplace culture. So in an age of connectedness where it's not unusual at all for people to have devices that feed right into their work email, and they may be hearing pings all weekend long, how can you manage the fact that you're living in this age of connectedness or over-connectedness with the expectation of the workplace culture that you will always be available through your device?
Well, I think we are learning to put some boundaries in place. I think it felt very exciting when the BlackBerry came in, that you could be connected, and we are living lives, I would say, of the blended self that most of us, I say most of us, those of us in service-based industries, those of us in office lives, not everybody, but the novelty became a bit of a burden. And so now we're having discussions about disconnection rather than connection. And that to me is very healthy. Yes, you need to I have a techno Shabbat on a Friday night. You don't have to be Jewish. You just disconnect one day out of 7 and say, I'm going to behave differently. I'm going to read in physical form, not digital form. I'm going to have a meal with my family. I actually am becoming more convinced that we do need to have culture rather than rules around the way we behave on email. I think email is a bit like sugar. There's too much of it, and it's addictive, and it's moreish. And I think we need to say, for instance, I no longer write to my employees after a certain time at night or on a weekend, because they're on a connected device and they're going to see it. And I feel I can wait. I can make myself a note to send to them for when their office opens. These are small changes that make a difference, like wearing a Fitbit to monitor your steps is a change. I think when you look at what we've done around physical health and mental health, it's a model. Put your hands up if you've ever bought trainers. And put your hands up if you've ever bought vitamins. And put your hands up if you've ever joined a club or a gym or something to look after. Okay, we've all done that. It's a $3.7 trillion market in wellness and well-being. It's twice the size of the pharmaceutical industry and the arms trade. So we've all, in 70 years, invested in culture and behaviors around being well and fit. I think we need to do that around our connected behaviors. I think we need to, measure our social health over the coming years like we measure our BMI. It's not perfect, but it's a way of saying how much I'm living online and offline is worth knowing. How much I'm replying all and how much I'm having bilaterals with the people in my office is a significant measurement of how connected we are to what's really happening. So I think it's time to take social health seriously, which is all of our connected behaviors, especially at a policy-making level, especially because governments and large institutions so obviously fail so much of the time. So they have got to change their behaviors. And not rely at scale. I spoke at the European Commission about a month ago, and it is frightening how it's full of great people, great hardworking people, and they work in enormous buildings and directorates that are connected, and you've never seen such a bunch of isolated people in your life. You've never seen such a group of people that can't really reach out to anybody that isn't the same grade as them. That's not healthy. That's not productive.
Any more questions? If not, I'm going to keep asking mine. So stop me. Okay, so speaking of policymakers, they typically want to make evidence-based decisions. So they're always looking for evidence. Is there a lack of evidence that there's a need for them to think harder about social health?
Yes, my next stage, I've just been given a new term at the Cass Business School in London as honorary visiting professor in workplace social health. And I also am on the European task force for a capital management firm's workforce institute, the Kronos Workforce Institute. It is time to now start testing and researching and producing some evidence that if you have half a workforce that carries on being overloaded with their emails and responsive to whatever tides of workload come their way, and you have the other half of the workforce in a cohort that experiments with having different jazz ensemble configurations, what outcomes can you measure? But it is absolutely clear that not having any strategy or tactic around our connected behaviors is insufficient. Nobody, I mean, some people might say I'm not going to act until I have that proof, but you should listen to Malcolm Gladwell's latest podcast on proof in revisionist history. I mean, there's proof and there's proof. It's pretty obvious what I'm saying. So yes, I'm going to produce some data to support certain elements of it, but actually people know what social health is already. It's just a question of how the organizational structures can be freed up for people to behave differently. And that's, I think, a big challenge. That's a big problem. Governments get re-elected, so their time frame is very precise and not necessarily conducive to saying, let's do it differently. Let's spend 6 months developing this idea before we measure it. Nobody likes that. That's not very career enhancing. So, you know, my favorite joke is how many Californian psychoanalysts does it take to change a light bulb? One, but the light bulb has to want to change. So, you know, there's got to be an appetite for change, like there was an appetite to stop smoking, like there's been an appetite to combat obesity. So I hope that what I'm doing is surfacing this reality, which no one yet, unless you put your hand up, no one yet has said, you're speaking BS, I don't believe you. Everybody's kind of agreeing. It's really what we do with that information that's the challenge. And we have to behave very, very differently.
Oh, there's another question.
As others not asking questions, I'm asking my question.
What do you do, sir, at the OECD? What's your role?
I'm a manager and dealing with development finance.
Okay.
So, I'm a German living in Paris, and I'm really fascinated by the fact that the French have captured or continue to really spend a lot of attention and money and value to good food. Mm-hmm. Just to tell a little story, yesterday my wife, also German, was reminded by her French colleagues not to eat fish. It was Monday, because the fish was only brought into Paris on Saturday. So you don't eat fish on Monday because it's no longer absolute fresh. Obviously, as a German, you know, we were really. Now, my question, as you're looking at the European landscape, is: do you see differences culturally how to deal with digital overload? You know, can we learn from other countries, or is this a class phenomenon, or is this basically a question whether you're connected to a fast internet line or not? I was just chatting with Johannes, my colleague here. We are dealing with development. So I've been living in Kenya. And in Kenya, you could easily see how people change their life, whether or not they're connected digitally or not. So there was a connection going to Mombasa, then a line to Nairobi, from Nairobi to Zambia.
Yes.
And you could see basically as they are connecting villages, if you like, to this connection, it changes lives. So my question is there something we can learn from others?
Well, I think there's a key divide between developed nations and developing nations. In the Congo, Habdari RDC is a digital news platform that's just won the Index on Censorship Freedom of Expression Awards. They're using digital journalism as a core driver of democracy in a way that, you know, digital journalism there's a fatigue, a distrust. Everybody in the West talks about fake news. To give just one example, Safaricom, much of Africa is being brought into an advanced state through technology in a way that we've had for many years. What I don't see, to answer your original question, is much of a difference in the perceived problems and behaviors across Europe. So I've been interviewed and spoken in Germany, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, here in France. The questions are the same. The concerns are the same. But amongst the professional working classes, those of us who are leading lives tethered to the technology, where we are drowning in an excess of communication and connectedness. I went to MIT Media Lab in Boston, Massachusetts a couple of months ago to interview Alex Pentland, the creator of what's been called social physics, which is very contemporary, complementary to social health. Social physics is about the way networks happen amongst people and information to create change or not to create change. And the answers are in fact there within network science. The answers are there. It's the application that we have to worry about. But no, I take your point, although I had fish last night in Paris. Of course there are cultural tropes. I think, as I'm coming from Britain, which is about to exit, with Brexit, I mean, there are differences. But any broadband, hyperconnected, civilized environment is facing the same issues. We worry about too much information. We worry about addiction. We worry about the design of the algorithms. We worry about privacy. We worry about validity and truth. What I want to do is make sure we worry about how we get from here to here. You know, I like the work that the OECD does because it does things, it makes things actually happen. And we need to make sure that the discussions around connectedness don't become indulgent. They need to become orientated around action. And that's a challenge. But I think we are fairly united across Europe. In fact, the British, I don't know about any other countries, but the British last week brought in the data protection law that exactly mirrored GDPR. It came in 2 days later. So,
good morning. My name is Noel Clean. I'm the Global Head of Public Policy for BDO, a professional services network with 75,000 people around the world, many of whom are students at various stages of apprenticeship in the world of accounting and tax and so forth. I think I heard you say that constant connectedness, affects the hardwiring of the brain, but that we're flexible and maybe we can reverse that. My question is, the younger students and so forth we have around the world, they seem to put a value on knowing where to find information online rather than knowing it. And I'm wondering if there's any research or thinking on the impact on knowledge, on creativity, on actually knowing stuff as opposed to knowing where to get it. Because if you have to always go online to find the answer to something, you can't deal with clients, you don't know the stuff yourself. So my question is really about what's the long-term impact on knowledge and creativity of constantly looking for it rather than knowing it.
Well, I think you are identifying a key risk, and I think you're right to identify it, which is that we are at risk of downplaying and downsizing the value of experience and knowledge that is built up, because that's expensive and requires investment and requires time. Time is the most precious resource after health and money. But what I believe is that every single organization, whether it's got 75,000 employees or 7, has an obligation and an ability to create pockets of behaviors where things are done slow, and those behaviors are emulated. Every behavioral science and social psychological research paper I've ever read shows how we copy other people's behavior. So it's absolutely true that young people are copying the Google story to look up, to search, to find. We now need to create different behaviors and different environments where to share, to not be certain, to find out and to learn continuously becomes part of the culture. I think culture is the key rather than regulation, and offsetting, like carbon offsetting, connectivity offsetting. But you're right, that is a big risk, although I do rather admire young people's ability to search and research. I have some fantastic undergraduates that I hire who, in 30 seconds they find things. It's marvelous.
We have another question over here.
Thank you very much. I'm András Lash from the Hungarian delegation, and thank you for this discussion today. I admire your book.
Thank you.
And my question is, you mentioned about the connectivity, and then when you're not sending emails anymore after Friday, before Monday, it's a dream come true. But my question is that, when I was young, I was born in 1980. So until I was 17 years old, we did not have the cell phones. And that's why when we discussed when to meet, we had to be there. Otherwise, the people would have left. Because after 10, 15 minutes, they would not have waited for us anymore. And once we had a mobile phone, once we had the internet, everything got so connected that it was okay to be late, 15, 20 minutes late, because we just dropped the message saying that I'll be late. Yeah. Please wait for me. And we had a discussion on that with my friends, and we came to a conclusion that, it's still in the culture of us that how much we respect each other. So no matter how connected we are, no matter what devices we are using, is the question of, do I respect you enough not to send you emails after Friday? Do I respect you enough not to drop you a message that I will be 15 minutes late if I could be there on time? But at the same time, it's very important to drop a message when there's something wrong happening, and then it's better that you inform the other.
I think what matters again is culture rather than rules, lifestyle rather than diet. In some ways, back to your point about food, I was inspired by some of the great food writers. And the greatest food writers are not actually remembered so much for their recipes as for giving you the values and the system. Elizabeth David brought to the British homes of the 1950s the idea that if you cooked with olive oil, it was really rather wonderful. Now, what you cooked with olive oil was your choice. So I don't want to be too prescriptive. in a particular situation, it's absolutely vital to send somebody a text to say, I'm running late because I'm running late. What matters is that you observe what I call the hierarchy of communication, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. At the moment, we value speed and scale more than we value intimacy, and that is a mistake. Even though it takes longer to meet one person, even though you reach less people. I mean, I have avoided doing webinars for my book. I talk to, this is my perfect size audience, because then you are, diplomats call it smelling the room. You know, you're looking at me, I'm looking at you, I'm noticing we are together in this experience, which is much more valuable. But we need to let go of the idea, I don't feel this isn't as valuable to me as an audience of 5,000 people. It's the opposite, it's more valuable. So the answer lies in how you value yourself in this world of speed and scale. And you must continue to meet face to face. I personally think it's never okay to be late, but that's, some people do.
We might have time for one more really quick question if anybody has one. Okay. No, I think we better wrap up, Julia. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Julia.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
And I think I'm signing books over there.
Oh, right. Sorry. One more thing. I wanted to mention that Julia will be signing copies of her book right over there in the book signing area. And the book is available actually in the OECD bookstore if you're interested. Thanks.
I think you did.
That was great.